No, we're off a great start. And Alan, your last question, who's in control, right? I mean, it's fundamentally about everything that we are now confronting with is how do we actually reach a point where, in fact, there's a majority of people for the greater good of technology. In a small way, this is why this group is together, in a small way. Because our idea would be that if we are responsible leaders and scholars and practitioners, we should be thinking about how to bring things together. And one of the issues, of course, is the whole idea of multi-sectoral framework. And of course, engaging public is so important. I'm hoping that from this meeting, we'll be able to put forward some ideas that is public-private, not just academia or scientists or the public-private. And we've done that elsewhere quite successfully, at least for us in climate and health, that this group will begin to at least pilot and move forward with the support of the Rob Califfs, the Monicas, and OSTP and others, and with the engagement of all of us to say, how do we do it right? And perhaps it's a starting point of moving it forward. So that's the who's in control. And I quite agree with the comment that the biggest challenge we face is how to engage the public in this conversation. They need to be involved, they need to have a voice, and so we need to do a lot better. Now, before we move forward, I do want to thank the Planning Committee. As you can see, this program is phenomenal. How we got here involves a lot of discussion of how to tee up the morning, how to get case studies, what cases to do, how to engage university presidents, journal editors, everybody. So I do want to thank Tim Person, Jay Schnitzer, Hannah Al-Samad, Tony Hatch, Alex Johnson, Shabita Pathrasabi, and of course Juan Enrique. Many of them are also here today. So thank you very much for helping us organize this. I also see my previous special assistant, Celine Balabat, here. She's actually one of the first to work with us on this area. So Celine, welcome. Okay, so now we're going to try to take a deeper dive into what's been done and how we actually use this knowledge and the inspiring talk of Alondra to move this forward. And of course, the two people that we asked to lead this are first Deborah Matthews and then also Keith Wailu. Now, Deborah is the Associate Director of Research and Programs for Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics, professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Now, she, in fact, as I said earlier, was actually working with the team, not in the committee, but in many ways working with the team to try to move this whole agenda forward in creating a multi-sectoral framework. She's going to tell you more about what we did, how we want to use this, and how we can explore going forward. Then there's Keith Wailu, of course. He is the Henry Putnam University Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He's done a lot of amazing stuff, but his research spans history and health policy, and particularly looking at intersection of race and health politics and the identity dynamics between ethnicity, gender, medicine, and of course, genetic and society. And he actually co-chaired with Ki Yamamoto the consent study that you can hear about. Deborah, do we start with you first? Come on up.
Good morning. Very difficult and intimidating acts to follow, but it's where I find myself. So I'm going to talk a bit about the work that we started, as Victor mentioned, 4 years ago with CESTI. So how do I move? There we go. With CESTI, which was the ad hoc committee that sort of did a lot of background research and work and deliberation that fed into the consensus study that Keith will talk about. So you've already had a series of fantastic talks that motivate the work that we did. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I'll highlight some of the things that that maybe weren't emphasized as much. So you've already heard about, how quickly science moves and that image of ethics running to catch up to the science. The technologies aren't staying in their lanes anymore. Current laws and structures are no longer fit for purpose. There's an increasing awareness that technologies affect our societies in uneven ways. Something that hasn't been emphasized as much as and that bears on the point on the prior slide about our regulatory structures no longer being fit for purpose, is this focus historically on individual benefit and harm, without tools and mandates to address ethical impacts at broader scales at group and population levels. As already noted, and I think what gives us sort of special emphasis, responsibility, and sort of traction in the space of health and medicine is the shared goal in health and medicine of improving human well-being that we don't, for example, have in broader AI spaces with ChatGPT, et cetera. And then I mentioned the lack of a mandate or capacity to attend to broader ethical principles, but I want to emphasize this further. It's not, we all say, here are the ethical principles that are guiding our work, but the tricky bit is really implementing those ethical principles in governance decisions. And we currently, not only do we not have the mandate to do that, we don't really have the tools or capacity to do that either. There we go. All right. So this is, I'll come back to this slide a couple of times just to let you know where we are. This is the sort of framework we used in Sesti's work to develop the framework for a cross-sectoral framework for governance of emerging tech in health and medicine that meaningfully implements ethical principles. So the case studies are the bottom-up approach that was sort of extended and challenged by some visioning exercises that we did, and then paired with the normative and conceptual commitments coming from the top down, and again, to be joined in the middle with this cross-sectoral governance framework. So the case study method was designed to provide concrete examples of emerging technologies that we could learn from, to enable us to look at technologies, a series of technologies that had a history of evolution and governance that we could learn from, and a trajectory ahead of them that we expected them to continue to evolve. They enabled us to identify key stakeholders, see where existing governance sort of worked well or created challenges or fell down, and to draw both unique and common lessons from across these series of cases. The case study structure was based on a technology assessment framework, included a vignette that drew out a series of issues that we were interested in, background on the technology and really its trajectory over time. It was framed by a series of guiding questions, importantly included the historical context of that technology, how it grew up, what its risks and benefits were over time, for example, status quo, and then this cross-sectoral footprint or analysis where we really tried to look at how the technology was playing out and being used and being governed across these 5 sectors, which will come up again later. And then, of course, inclusion of the ethical and societal implications. We also looked just a little bit beyond the core technology we were looking at other enabling technologies that were extending or shifting the capacities of the primary technology. And then, as I already mentioned, visioning, looking at where this technology was likely to go over the next 5 to 10 years to further explore some of the issues that maybe aren't present today, but we anticipate will be present in the near future. I'm going to just very briefly go through the 3 case studies. These have all been published and are available. So the first one was on neurotechnology, in particular transcranial direct current stimulation. We liked this technology not only because it intervenes on the brain, and we are a very brain-centered, centric species, but also because it's used in research, it's used clinically, and it's available commercially and has this really robust direct-to-consumer or DIY component. You can find instructions on Reddit on how to build your own TDCS machine and use it to modulate your brain. The second case was telehealth. So our very first meeting as a group was in January of 2020. It was also our very last meeting as a group, at least in person. So telehealth became very, very important and seemed to us, even though it's not an individual technology, it's a platform, it was a very useful case study for us. In particular, because of the way it demonstrated how responsive governance can be when push comes to shove. And then finally, regenerative medicine, which was our most complicated case, and we wanted a case that included living tissue as therapy. Tissue as treatment is a little bit different than other areas or other kinds of treatments. Long history of use in research and clinical care, multiple commercial markets, a very rich and varied governance history, and with significant equity issues baked right into the technology at the genetic level. So we took these three cases and we looked across them and tried to draw out common themes that would help inform key components of a governance framework. You can see some of the common themes here. The coexistence of health and non-health applications, as I already alluded to, regulatory nimbleness in response to COVID, the impact of early public success and failure on innovation, and because we're in the health and medicine space and concerns about privacy, there's little protection of privacy outside covered entities, which is HIPAA language. Some of the unique themes that arose just in a single case include how minimal physical risks enable permissiveness. So this is the TDCS case and the DIY stuff. The flexibility or lack of oversight in the gray area before proven efficacy and regulated product. And the challenges when a technology thrives in unregulated spaces. And I'll just point out that our work was all completed before ChatGPT dropped. Yet all of those unique themes apply directly to that technology. And I think many of the lessons that we learned are absolutely applicable to generative AI and other forms of AI. So again, back to the framework, that was the case studies were the bottom up. What can we learn from what we've done thus far? And then the principles and values are the top down. And you'll see these again when I come back to the heat map after Keith speaks. But all of these ethical principles will look quite familiar to you. But we tried not only to articulate the principles, but then also to begin to do that translational work of how do you take the guiding ethical principles and translate them into governance decisions, both about what policy is made and how policy is made, and started to try to articulate some of the tools that would enable us to do that. And then again, all of this was meant to join up in the middle with a cross-sectoral framework. We, of course, were not taking it all the way to a formal framework. That was Esti's goal, but we, through our work, identified these series of framework elements that would be critical to consider and incorporate in the development of a final governance framework. These included, of course, the foundational core of ethical principles and values, informational elements, including scientific assessment, and critically public engagement and democratic deliberation, which we've already had some conversation about, and I completely agree with Tim, it's easy to say and much harder to do. Assessment, not only tech assessment and foresight or that visioning piece, but also risk-benefit analysis where risk and benefit are construed broadly. Alignment of incentives and disincentives, so I co-sign everything you said in your talk, Alondra, and particularly this piece of how the ecosystem has shifted so much from government funding to private funding. right? And we focused, one of the things that we really learned from our business sector colleagues in CESTI was the importance of incentives and aligning incentives with industry needs and interests to get them to play, right? And then the composite heat map, which I'll come to after Keith, the importance of coordinated governance because of the cross-sectoral aspect of this, and then finally ongoing mechanisms for iterative evaluation and course correction, because these technologies evolve over time, the social life of DNA, et cetera, the algorithms that Alondra mentioned, and this is sort of a brief description of the work that we did that was then handed off to the consensus study.
So thanks. That gives you a clear sense of the very simple task that we were handed with SD, which, as everyone has said, we live in this remarkable time of innovation. You've heard it from many people: AI, gene editing, machine learning, novel therapeutics. We all understand that novel therapeutics diffuse unevenly, benefiting some and impacting others less so, if at all. And so it was this charge to think about a new framework that foregrounds equity rather than having equity be a regular and consistent afterthought in the innovation system that we were handed. That's the charge you were handed. And I want to say that it's an extraordinarily expansive charge, but we had, Keith and I, an extraordinary committee that really did just exceptional work, so applause to them. What I have been asked to do is in 20 minutes describe some of the core observations and findings and then the 6 recommendations. So, where am I? Whoop, wrong direction. So there are 3 messages that emerged from this report about whose concerns should be addressed in a new framework, a new governance model. The systematic effort that is needed to foreground equity, in much the same way as Victor pointed out, other ethical values such as protection of human subjects is foundational to our current system. The process that produced those commitments across our system, the question is what would it take to foreground equity, to make equity such a foundational set of commitments throughout an innovation system, in fact, throughout science and medicine more generally. And so the 3 messages involved an innovation system that should have the capacity to address the needs and concerns of all the system's users, including underrepresented and underserved communities, the importance of building guardrails and incentives to advance the common good without imposing undue regulations or constraints, a tricky balancing act. The importance of aligning innovation with equity, requiring systematic effort to reorient the culture of innovation, where every actor, even those who do not think that they have a stake, actually are enlisted. How you solve, as we used to say in the committee, the not my problem. We argued that this includes substantive participation in innovation by a wider range of users and communities, expanding who is empowered as a stakeholder or a rights holder in innovation. Another key message was that achieving this vision requires national priority setting and coordination, embedding awareness of equity as a norm in the culture of innovation. It involves evidence-based equity science, one of our key recommendations, but provides qualitative as well as quantitative methods, metrics, and benchmarks to guide innovation, decision-making, and assessment. And it also involves context-specific guidance. That is to say, not all areas of technology innovation are equivalent, and whatever governance models are embraced need to be tailored and really tailored to context-specific guidances that translate the aims to practices in each area of science and technology. Why, just another observation about why value equitable innovation at all. The committee argued that attention to equity with regard to issues of race, gender, sexuality, disability, etc., geography, rural sector access being really crucial, is a fundamental to innovation that is responsive to the general welfare. Equity, we argued, contributes to scientific and technical excellence and objectivity by broadening the demographics included during innovation, research, and development. We also argued that, valued equitable innovation because attention to this value can support social trust at a time of mistrust in science and technology. Equitable innovation is, we argued, also economically, or can be economically beneficial. Development without attention to equity can limit, for instance, a technology's positive impact. Barriers that prevent people from accessing, using, and benefiting these products can undercut profits by shrinking the pool of customers. Barriers that prevent diverse entrepreneurs from attracting investors can limit the potential financial gains of those investors. The report includes this helpful schematic, and as Alondra pointed out, there's no perfect way of visualizing this ecosystem, but it's intended to convey, one schematic understanding of an innovation life cycle. If we were to design a better one that's more interactive, as Alondra had said, maybe we should have asked ChatGPT how to do it. No, but I mean, this is an attempt to capture some of the dynamics of an innovative ecosystem, the innovation life cycle, with the imperatives listed on the left side of the screen. The imperative to broaden participation and sharing responsibility to empower a wider range of stakeholders. The imperative to align incentives to encourage equitable decision-making. And these are not just imperatives that apply to any one stage, but the goal here is, how do you make these imperatives relevant to the conceptualization and embarking on the idea stage, or the sponsoring research stage, the funding stage? How do you make these kinds of values of determining how inequities develop along technology innovation life cycles and taking responsibility for mitigating them? How do you make this relevant to the research and development stage, or the early evaluation of a technology's performance stage? How do you make the value of crafting timely guidance relevant? How do you integrate this into the way in which technology is developed early on, so that we don't have the problem that others have pointed out to, which is you have CRISPR-Cas9 for sickle cell disease where the costs are way out of reach. Representative Foster said something really interesting. How do you design a system that asks the question, as he put it, what can be accomplished in a small budget scenario? Now, what would innovation look like if that question was asked early in the process, right? So these are the kinds of equity questions that can be posed. How do you build that system? The idea here is it would produce advances in equitable innovation. I won't read everything here, but the committee really thought long and hard, and the report involves, thinking about equity in a lot of different ways. Topical equity, for instance, is how does an innovation portfolio, does it take account of the topic range of innovation that is relevant, that makes the innovation relevant to communities more broadly, even at the earlier stages of conceptualization. Input equity, evaluation equity, deployment equity, and attention equity. I won't go through all of these, but just to illustrate the careful attention that the committee paid to the question of equity and what it means to embed it at different stages and what kinds of ideas about equity are relevant. I should say here that what we often try to do here is to note that these are there are multiple opportunities for action throughout the innovation system, but relevant to different stakeholders. For instance, funders might ask, if you look at the top range on the right-hand side, what examples for action might funders take? Might including diverse perspectives on review panels. So the committee didn't just sort of think about equity as a broad set of conceptual commitments, but really began to think about research and development, funders, where appropriate, would it be possible to require applicants to address equity associated with proposed work? We thought about how effective communities might be important, what questions, how they might be enrolled in the stage of conceptualizing and embarking on an idea. Similarly, on the lower level, we asked in the research and development and the assemblement of a technology, what role do researchers or R&D organizations have in using best practices for co-designing research with affected communities? When we got to the question of evaluating a technology's performance, we asked comparable questions about what role regulators play, regulatory stakeholders, for instance, requiring assessments that meaningfully reflect the full range of intended users and contexts, or incorporating mechanisms for engagement with these affected communities. We asked whether healthcare payers and delivery stakeholders might include what we called for, which is equity science metrics and analysis in purchasing, use, and coverage decision. So there's not just high-level thinking about what equity means. There are also very practical guidances throughout this report about how one might operationalize these commitments as part of a framework, a new framework for governance. Let me turn very quickly to the recommendations, of which there were 6. The first, given the fact that we were calling for national priority setting, we suggested, we recommended, depending on how soft or hard you want to make, our conclusions, the establishment of a national leadership to embed these principles of equity in science, technology, and innovation, and health and medicine, and looked specifically to the White House Office of Science and Technology, which should, we argued, in a reconstituted form perhaps, lead federal efforts, working with agencies and the White House Steering Committee on Equity to operationalize an equity governance framework that's based on or builds on our recommendations. We argue that OSTP should convene a multi-stakeholder cross-sectoral equity in biomedical innovation task force to build awareness and define goals and benchmarks, measures, and metrics at each stage of innovation. Our second recommendation was to create an innovation culture that integrates equity, these equity considerations, into the organizational practice of technology development. Organizations, we suggested, that oversee research and development and generate intellectual property should be attentive to equity through training, policies, research investments, study design, technology licensing, development and scaling up, and patient and consumer use. Individuals and organizations within the innovation system should align, that magic word, align, their portfolios with many forms of equity and be mindful of why and how equity is relevant in innovation. And that's why the specific kinds of equity in our report come in very handy. We speak about incentives for aligning of innovation with equitable benefit. Organizations that fund and oversee innovation in health and medicine should incentivize grantees, researchers, and partners to interrogate alignment of technologies, to ask the very question that was posed to us earlier. How does this align with these values? At choice points along the technology life cycle. Governance levers, we argue, to advance these incentives should include federal and state laws and regulations, requirements for research design, funding, approval, publication, and evaluation, professional standards and practices, as well as targeted funding, as well as market incentives. A wide range of tools might be brought to bear. One of the trickier recommendations, but really urgent, is how to go about empowering diverse communities to participate in this innovation system. We argued that leaders across the innovation lifecycle should convene experts in community engagement, participatory research, inclusive design, and participatory technology assessment. There's a lot of work being done in this, just bringing people together who are doing it, to think about how this might be implemented could be valued, to address decision-making issues and center the interests of affected communities. Identify best practices and methods for recognizing and valuing sustained input from a broader range of community stakeholders, including those historically underserved and marginalized, in the creation of technologies that affect their health and well-being. That is, getting people involved who don't understand, who don't necessarily see that they have stakes in this system. Recommendation number 5 involved, as I mentioned earlier, developing equity science for technology innovation. We suggested that NIH, NSF, and philanthropic organizations should support the development of equity science that establishes methods, metrics, and benchmarks for assessing context-specific implications of science technology innovation. We need a robust equity science that should determine how inequities arise, evaluate the impacts of different stakeholder actions and decisions, assess how innovation systems can change in response to evidence, and define how success is measured. Measuring outcome is not an easy thing, and in some ways we need to bolster and develop a science that allows us to actually inform this system. And finally, the need for designing context-specific strategies and tools to advance equity in the innovation lifecycle. We suggested that there is a trend towards equity playbooks in various areas of new science. Equity playbooks can serve as guides to concrete strategies, key questions, effective suggestions, and specific tools to translate the governance framework into practices in the AI community, practices in genetic research communities, advancing equity through the innovation lifecycle. And finally, that participants in the innovation system should consider developing and promulgating these playbooks targeted to different areas of science and technology innovation and different stakeholder communities and choice points in the innovation life cycle. So that's a quick overview, back to Deborah now, about some of the metrics.
All right, so if you were leafing through your attendee packet, you might have seen something that looks like this and wondered what that is. You actually have several versions of this in your packet. This is the heat map I alluded to earlier that was one element of CESTI's outputs. And I'm just going to walk you through it. We're hoping that this will be a useful tool in the context of our breakout groups later today. But it's also quite complicated, so I wanted to walk you through it. So a heat map is just one governance tool that can help facilitate a shared understanding of the impact of a technology in its current governance ecosystem with regard to social benefit. So it provides, the idea was that it provides a visual representation of the results of a process that evaluates the alignment of a technology's impact under current governance with guiding ethical principles. And I already showed you the guiding ethical principles that CESTI came to in its work. And these are the same principles in different form, and I'm gonna walk you through sort of how these cash out in the context of the heat map. And again, this is designed, the heat map as a concept is designed as it's not intended to be like a fixed static tool, but is rather a flexible framework for again, getting a snapshot of how a technology is doing at a particular moment in a current governance ecosystem against the ethical principles that we hold up as guiding us. So just as an example, the kinds of questions that you might ask about a technology under the principle of justice is how equitable is individual access to the benefits, right? How equitable is distribution of burdens across individuals? What's the impact on existing health disparities? What's the impact on existing economic disparities, right? These are really big questions, but they're more specific than justice, and we'll drill down further. So the same thing for autonomy, and I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of this. Again, these are the questions that are down the left-hand side of all of the 3 heat maps that are in your packet. Fairness, just as an example, right? Is there a mechanism for stakeholder engagement and incorporation of public interests and values? Again, the devil is in the details there. Collective good, how equitable is group access to benefits? What's the environmental impact of the research or technology? And then finally, individual good, for example, is foreseeable harm being avoided or sufficiently mitigated? So that's one part. That's down the left-hand side, questions that try to tease out or get a little bit more concrete about the impact of this technology with respect to the principles. Because this is a cross-sectoral framework, for all the reasons we've already discussed, right, there's also then a place for the sector of deployment, because you don't want to look just in one place, but try to get a snapshot of the entire picture of this technology. So this is the same sectors that I showed you earlier, but in a different format. And again, this is the top bar in those heat map figures with the 5 sectors that Sesti articulated. And then underneath each of those sectors, right, particular contexts in which the technology might be evaluated. So in the context of academia, clinical research, disease targets, what are the disease targets that are being chosen? Who is being recruited and how? In the private sector, what's the investment in translational research and applications? Which research, which applications? What are the markets that are being targeted? What's the planned business model? And again, you're going to be asking those questions that I just showed you. Are there disparate impacts in each of these contexts within sectors? So in target markets, what are the target markets being selected? What are those evenly distributed? Are they focused in a particular way? Who is getting the potential benefits? Who is suffering the potential harms, et cetera, in these particular contexts for this particular technology? Again, trying to do that translational work from guiding ethical principles into actually how the technology is being deployed, used, governed, et cetera. And then we're not, I work in bioethics, it's all shades of gray, but here, right, we have shades of, from dark blue to red, trying to get a sense of not only is it in each of these contexts against the particular questions, do we perceive a risk or do we perceive a benefit? And what's the relative magnitude of the risk or the benefit? The idea being that you end up with something like this, which if I had showed you this first would have been, inscrutable, but now you can get a sense that the reason it's called heat map, right, is because it gives you a sense of where in general are we doing well, and where in general might we need to be focusing additional governance attention to realign the impact of the technology with the ethical principles we purport to have guiding us. Of course, it's not as simple as that, right? Because these are very complicated questions. As I said, it's all shades of gray. But again, we're trying to get an overall snapshot of a technology, again, in a particular context, under a particular governance framework that can enable governance actors such as policymakers to target interventions, right, like laws, regulations, professional guidelines, to areas of greatest need, which would be the areas of red, or the darkest, the areas with risk as opposed to benefit. Although it's important to note that the heat map can also identify where we're doing well and suggest that there are places that we might be able to learn lessons that are translatable to other areas. But as I already said, it's not always straightforward. There are still questions. This is, as I said before, a flexible tool. This is not fixed or static. And there are still lots of questions about exactly how it can be used, deployed, and how it might be useful, right? Do we have, I have some questions in there, but are those the right questions or markers of alignment for the technology being assessed? Who's completing the heat map? What are their interests, values, incentives? How will disagreements about answers to any particular question be adjudicated? What if the answer to a particular question includes both benefit and risk? Right? We had a great talk at the Berman Institute yesterday from Jen James, who raised the question of safety for whom? Right? Safety doesn't mean the same thing to all people. What can be safe for one person is decidedly unsafe for others. And then what are triggers for reassessment in this iterative process of trying to steer the ship of emerging tech in health and medicine?